Thank you, Rosie, and I'd like to welcome you all to the first panel of the Humanitarian Summit. May I request all of the panelists to come and take their seats, please. So this is like 1.5 hour session, and I'll just give you a brief introduction to the center and what we are doing, and then we'll have 4 wonderful papers. And after all the papers, then I'll open the floor for question and answer. So you'll have an opportunity to put forward your questions and comments. So this is the center. The Center for Gender and Disaster was established in 2018 March. It is part of IRDR's initiatives, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, I should say, center, and it works very closely with the Humanitarian Institute. More importantly, the director of the center, and there is a photo of her because he could not be here. He's traveling at the moment, and you know me, so I'm the co-director. And you can follow us on Twitter, and these are some of the hashtags that we use. Feel free to tweet about this event. If you like anything, if you want to comment on anything, use those hashtags, and that's a Twitter handle for us. So this is what the reason is of the center. So we work very closely with the IRDR, Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, as well as Humanitarian Institute. We create a gender space. The aim of this center is to create a gender space within these 2 institutes and mainstream gender into all of the work we do, from research and as well as teaching, as well as organizing various events, focusing especially on gender. We have identified 5 pillars. So these are some of the pillars that we work on: and social justice, equality and equity, engineering and infrastructure, transformative technologies, data, health and well-being. We are offering a new module from the coming academic year. It's an MSc module on gender, disaster and conflict. We'll have exciting guest lectures, so please spread the word. We also do various kinds of research. So we do research, we are part of so many of research carried out by the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction as well as Humanitarian Institute, as well as we do other independent research as well at the center. So some of the projects that we are working on at the moment are envisioning the feminist-informed post-disaster city, gender and post-conflict transformation, women in policy-making level, UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and its implementation. We also do policy analysis, especially on disaster risk reduction. And we, as I said earlier, we actively are engaged with various research activities of those institutes. We also organize monthly seminars on gender, disaster, and conflict. And we invite visiting fellows from various universities to come and work with us. For a short period of time, we have had a couple of visiting fellows already. And we also would like to have more practitioners coming and visiting us. We have prepared an analytic bibliography, which is work in progress, I should say, on gender development, gender conflict and disaster. We have identified those literature are categorized under 29 themes. These are some of the themes. It is, as I said, it is work in progress. If you have anything, if you know about anything else, any other new work coming out, please let us know. This we aim to publish this on our website. It is in progress, and we'll let you know once it is uploaded on our website. One thing that I would like to note is that very few men are working on gender, so we would love to have more men doing gender-related research. And these are some of the keywords that we found. So as I said earlier, follow us on social media. And now I'd like to invite our first panelist. Hayden, and this is the title of his presentation. You have 12 minutes to present, and then we'll go on to the next panelist. And we will give you the time. You will get the sign when 2 minutes is left, and then the next time we will start.
Okay.
Thank you.
Shall I do it from here or from? Yeah. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Am I turning it off? Hello? Yeah, hi, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Great, perfect. Okay, so hi, my name is Aidan, and I'm a PhD candidate here at UCL, where my research is investigating LGBT or queer-led responses to refugees. Today I'm presenting on the roles of LGBT-led organisations in Lebanon and Turkey, responding to refugees from Syria since 2011. In both countries, I spoke with representatives of queer-led organisations who offer support to refugees in order to better understand the challenges that they face. But before I delve into a discussion of the research findings, I will first outline the wider context. So sexual orientation and gender identity-based asylum is a relatively novel route to protection for refugees. UNHCR issued its first guidance on SOGI asylum as recently as 2008. In 2012, their guidance explicitly stated that SOGI-based claims could be made under the 1951 Convention's protection for membership of a particular social group. This recognised how queer peoples may face persecution because they are perceived as belonging to a discrete, socially acknowledged group defined by their sexuality and gender identity. However, the law around SOGI-based asylum has been developed, the way that it's been developed suggests a reliance on a number of assumptions that potentially marginalise diverse queer communities from view. For example, adjudicators in resettlement donor states may typically evoke LGBT identities when they think about membership of a particular social group. However, LGBT identity categories are not universal expressions of sexual difference, but are rooted in an English-speaking tradition where rights for queer peoples were claimed through visibly organising around minority identities. By contrast, you may be a man who has sex with other men and face persecution because of the taboo related to sexual practice. This is certainly the case for some refugees from Syria who live in Lebanon and Turkey. They may not have what practitioners call an identity connection, but they face persecution nonetheless. As such, we need to think carefully about how the law, and the way that it is mobilised by humanitarian actors, understands and engages with questions of sexual difference. It is this tension that is of key interest to my presentation today, namely how do queer organisations navigate the politics of rights and recognition in their support for queer refugees. A further point to consider relates to the wider geopolitics of sexual rights, which inevitably shapes the contexts in which queer-led organisations operate. For example, among right-wing and conservative English-speaking media, the fact that we welcome LGBT refugees is testament to our liberal politics of inclusion, which is nevertheless presented here as under threat from the forces of radical Islam. In this Daily Mail headline of 2015, the one at the top there, homosexuals appear to have entered into a sort of holy trinity of compassion and deservingness, becoming worthy victims alongside Christians and women. In this sense, queer refugees become ideal subjects in the construction of Islamophobic and xenophobic narratives of persecution. And queer persecution, in this sense, justifies the hardening of borders in order to protect liberal rights of tolerance and sexual difference. But by contrast, leaders like Erdogan in Turkey denounced the EU in 2016 for caring more about gay rights than Syrian refugees, as he saw it. This backlash against LGBT rights in Turkey is echoed in Lebanon, where the perceived visibility of queer peoples is thought to reflect the influence of the rise of European neocolonialism. Moreover, in Erdogan's eyes, Europe's concern for sexual rights rings morally hollow when contrasted with the EU's hard borders. So, of course, it is vital that we interrogate these narratives and how they are strategically deployed by states and actors and the media to justify either the negative treatment of refugees or of queer peoples. Of course, for queer-led organisations that support refugees in Lebanon and Turkey, this context is tantamount to operating on the front line of a discursive battle, where claims for rights and recognition are made all the more challenging. For example, one interviewee in Turkey commented that it was like working between two rights regimes, adding, "There is racism in Europe, all of the Western organisations are failing to meet the challenges to freedom of expression in Turkey." This recognition of the failure of both the West and the Turkish government to ensure rights protections across the board is symptomatic of the tensions queer organisations in both Lebanon and Turkey face by virtue of their position in both relation to the global north and the global south, including states, donors, humanitarian organisations, and local communities. Nevertheless, one of the key forms of assistance provided by queer-led organisations to refugees relates to support with international resettlement claims. Given the aforementioned ways in which donor state adjudicators typically engage with sexual difference, preferring credible identities that conform to LGBT frameworks, queer-led organisations tend to encourage beneficiaries to come into an identity connection in order to support their claim. For example, as one practitioner in Istanbul says, "What matters is that refugees have a kind of identity awareness. Okay, I am gay, bisexual, or transsexual. Somehow this makes it easier to access support. For other people who might not have an identity connection but face persecution, they might not be able to access support." So in a situation of precarity and insecurity, this identity connection may allow organisations to offer more useful and targeted referrals relating to the specific challenges that queer people face. However, in lieu of an identity connection, individuals may miss out on key services. Nevertheless, the lengths that individuals will go to prove their credibility is notable. One interviewee discussed how an applicant for international protection felt obliged to arrive to his UNHCR interview in full makeup to demonstrate that he was gay enough for international resettlement. Whilst this is not something that UNHCR itself will base a decision on, this anticipation of the burden of proof that applicants feel means they'll often go to lengths that could actually increase the chance that they're at risk of persecution. This is something that comes through very strongly in Kadulcin's research, where she identified that the low level of applicants for international resettlement under LGBT cases in Turkey was linked actually to this sense that trying to secure protection actually increased the risk of persecution. So people would be deliberately, because there's a sense you need to be more visibly gay in order to be protected. Similarly, language barriers and familiarity with the correct identity language cause troubles. Refugees from Syria may rely on colloquial or vernacular phrases to express their sexual identity when giving evidence, describing themselves as lupi, which may be translated in a derogatory way as faggot, for example. And this, when translated, may undermine a claim because it shows you're not proud of your identity, for example. So other phrases may be preferred or encouraged. And this is something that organisations do in order to try and coach. So this is something I'd like to draw attention to, the way that queer organisations are sort of challenging the politics of recognition. They act as mediators between a variety of rights regimes, deploying coaching practices that help to translate the subjectivities of those they support so that they might be recognised by normative humanitarian frameworks. This also requires presenting themselves to funders in line with some of these narratives and expectations of LGBT rights work, whilst nevertheless remaining critical of such frameworks' more rigid understanding of sexual difference. For example, one practitioner in Beirut told me, you are put in a box, like you have to be gay. No, you have a lot of people who are straight, emotionally they are attracted to women, but sometimes they like partying and have sex with a guy and face persecution. This kind of boxing thing I am not with. Yeah. Similarly, drama therapy workshops are common in several organisations in Lebanon and Turkey. These offer psychosocial support without pathologizing the experiences of queer refugees. For example, rather than concluding that one beneficiary's discomfort with LGBT identities is evidence of internalized homophobia, drama workshops aim to create an open, welcoming space where subjectivities and experiences can be explored without the need to conform to a particular identity or narrative. So yeah, here's some examples of the work that queer-led organisations do. Nevertheless, it is important not to over-idealise such responses. They remain caught up in a wider politics of recognition and sexual rights outlined earlier, leading to instances where the otherwise welcoming spaces of queer-led organisations can simultaneously give way to internal policing and competition. As Shaksari's research in Istanbul observed, competition for a place on UNHCR's resettlement scheme encourages refugees to determine that they were more gay and therefore more deserving than a place. Such aspects of credibility take on a notably gender dimension too, with a focus on visibility, obscuring queer women whose access to space is itself served by various patriarchal norms. Faith, and particularly Islam, was also a notable area where exclusions formed. One interviewee in Beirut noted how many beneficiaries asked how one could be gay and a Muslim, demonstrating a conformity to secular and Islamophobic narratives that say LGBT rights are incompatible with Islam. In response, organisations try to be inclusive, which basically means they don't talk about faith, which itself may marginalise queer people of faith from speaking about their own relationship with faith and sexuality. So, in conclusion, how can we conceptualise the roles played by queer-led organisations in displacement and conflict-affected contexts? Queer-led organisations are inevitably compromised by the wider context in which they work. They operate between regimes of recognition, requiring them to navigate conflicting notions of rights and diverse structural barriers. Nevertheless, they tactically engage with such structures, mobilising them in pursuit of operational funding, or crucially, to ensure that those they support may secure international protection by coaching them to speak the language of LGBT rights. Moreover, within the small space of their support rooms, they demonstrate a model of care and support that contrasts with the more conditional nature of formal humanitarian responses. A refusal by some organisations to not ask how beneficiaries may identify demonstrates how such organisations are bound by a queer logic of subjectivity, challenging the epistemic violence that often follows when people are required to fit into an identity category. Nevertheless, challenges remain, not least related to the diverse forms of gendered and religious marginalisation that emerge in the context of support groups. Yet these tensions inevitably follow on from an awareness of the conditionality of the wider humanitarian system, where one is expected to ask for rights in the right way. Approaching questions of rights and recognition from a queer perspective, as many of these organisations attempt to do, is something that should be encouraged. And I will finish there. Thank you.
So I'd like to now introduce our second panelist, Jordana Romano. She just finished her PhD from LSE, so congratulations to her. And today she is going to be talking about engendering community-based disaster risk reduction and management, lessons from the Metro Cebu, Philippines. And you have 12 minutes.
Don't start the time yet. Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. So thanks very much for joining us this morning. My presentation today draws on 7 months of ethnographic fieldwork conducted as part of my PhD, which was exploring the gender politics of risk and community organizing in response to risk in informal settlements in the Philippines. And as many of you are aware, the Philippines is one of the most disaster-affected countries in the world, and particularly vulnerable to the current and future impacts of climate change. So my research was focused in Metro Cebu, which is the second largest city in the Philippines after Metro Manila, located in the central Visayas, right around here. And it has a population of just under 3 million people, approximately 200,000 of whom are estimated to be living in informal settlements. So my research was focused on 5 different informal settlements across the 2 most highly urbanized cities, Cebu and Mandaue City. And collectively, these settlements encompassed a range of topographic, geographic, and environmental characteristics that meant they were exposed to different types of environmental hazards, like floods, fires, landslides, and so on. Now, despite these settlements being located on land typically deemed undesirable by those with alternatives, rapid urbanization coupled with severe land shortages and an increasingly competitive landscape of commercial and property development has made land tenure actually one of the most pressing issues affecting the urban core of Cebu. And amidst this context of multiple and overlapping forms of risk and insecurity, community organizing has actually become quite a critical mechanism for the urban poor to contest policies and practices that adversely affect them. And it's also become a kind of avenue that local governments and NGOs are harnessing and using in support and in terms of advancing disaster risk reduction and management. Within this space, like community participation, both in terms of urban development and in terms of the disaster risk reduction programs, community participation is really being celebrated as like a central ethos to implementation. But it's important to note that these movements are largely mobilized and driven by women. So a big part of my research was looking at like why and what are the kind of consequences and impacts of that. So I'm going to share some of these findings with you today and hope that it can help inform the way that we approach and evaluate gender mainstreaming in the context of disaster risk reduction and management programs. All right. So risk and insecurity both conceptually and tangibly shape the day-to-day realities of men and women living in the settlements that I was working in. And interestingly, overwhelmingly across all the study sites, despite the fact that they were danger zones, which because of their sort of propensity and vulnerability to disaster risk in a more traditional sense, actually the main issue that preoccupied both men and women was actually the issue of land tenure security. And this was a major reason that prompted them to join a homeowner association, because they felt that by doing so, they would be less easily displaced without some sort of relocation support or compensation. Now, in saying that land tenure security was like the focus, actually land tenure insecurity and disaster risk are quite intimately connected. For example, fires, which were certainly the most feared of disasters or traditional disasters amongst respondents that I met with, were often a precursor to eviction. So many people told me stories about suspected arson, particularly on privately owned plots of land, whereby landowners would use the exodus preceding a fire as a kind of chance to ring fence the area and prevent people from coming back and building, or rebuilding rather. And in the context of flooding, in Metro Cebu, as elsewhere in the Philippines, municipal governments are undertaking the massive task of clearing informal settlements located along waterways or danger zones, as they've been popularly labeled. So although the threat of land tenure insecurity was spoken about by both men and women, it actually seemed to be a greater source of worry and anxiety for the women. And my research indicates this is at least partially attributed to women's heightened sense of financial insecurity and kind of economic dependency. And similarly, hazards relating to waste disposal, such as like flooding as a consequence of blocked drains, dengue, waterborne illnesses, environmental contamination, which were pervasive issues across all 5 communities, also seem to preoccupy women more than men. This was indicated by the frequency with which they spoke about these issues and also the kind of undertones of their narratives. And on the other hand, men expressed particular concern over aspects of like, physical infrastructure, so like water, electricity, roads, and transportation links, which had a particular impact on their livelihood and income generating potential. Now, these differences in how men and women speak about internalized risk are intimately connected with participation, as I will argue, and actually they make a lot of sense when we think about them in terms of gender roles, mobilities, and identities. So with women, for example, typically more confined to the domestic realm in both productive and reproductive roles, and with gendered identities that are intimately tied to the home environment, it's a little surprise that they care about things that are going on within that space. And the same goes for men in the context of livelihoods, which remains a central part of male identity in the Philippines. So I'm arguing that actually these gendered differences in perceptions of and encounters with risks that are connected with gender mobility, identity, and so on are actually contributing to the largely feminized patterns of participation in community-based risk reduction that we see in the Philippines. And this is a pattern that you can observe not just in Cebu, but its prevalent across our world. So a key avenue through which local disaster risk management and risk management more broadly is kind of taking place within informal settlements actually happens through something called bayanihan. So bayanihan is a Tagalog term that is pertains to the spirit of cooperation and collective action. And homeowner associations have mandated kind of bayanihan activities on a monthly basis. And examples of these in the context of urban informal settlements include going around and collecting garbage from creeks and drainage areas, as well as like building and repairing infrastructure like toilets, roads, houses, and so on. Now, participation, as I said, is mandated through the homeowner association. So everyone's supposed to participate in this, and if you can't participate, you should like offer some money for snacks or materials in lieu of your labor. However, as is often the case in collective kind of responsibilities, these duties are rarely shared in practice. And according to my observations and kind of reinforced by male and female testimonies, actually women are the main volunteers on the ground that are leading these initiatives. And this is especially the case in context of waste clearing activities, which are the most prominent forms of bayanihan, and also arguably among the least appealing. Now, conversely, men tend to participate a lot more, and this comes back to my key argument, in bayanihan events that are oriented around more stereotypically male domains, such as construction, road repair, painting the church, for example, and so on. That said, women are still present, both as laborers and in background cooking, which is a key part of bayanihan as well. So I should also note that across all the communities that I was working in Bar 1, the majority of the officers running the homeowner association, so these are the individuals that are elected as representatives, and they also run on the day-to-day kind of implementation and initiation of activities. In all Bar 1 of the communities I was working in, these were almost entirely women. And conversely, again, at the board of directors or board of trustees level, which is a much more kind of removed role, more visible clout, but actually not necessarily much action or time investment required, you did see more men. But again, women were arguably, in most cases, among the majority there as well. And these patterns that, that I'm depicting to you extend to more traditional realms of disaster risk reduction as well. So homeowner associations set up like emergency response teams and deliver disaster awareness training and so on. And within these spaces, even though the emergency response teams attracted significantly more men than any other activities run by the homeowner association, and especially so in the search and rescue function, where most of the volunteers are almost entirely men. Conversely, in the emergency response teams section of like first aid and camp management, which are predominantly female volunteers who are responsible for treating local needs and assessing damages, and generally speaking have responsibilities that extend far beyond the moment of an event itself. So these observations that I'm noting very much follow Elena Narson's observations following Hurricane Katrina, where she observed that men were particularly active in the highly visible and immediate kind of cleanup operations, while the arduous labor was undertaken by women in the long term remained both, and I quote her, exceptional and exceptionally invisible. So I'm actually arguing that through these examples, that community-based disaster risk reduction is advertently or inadvertently perpetuating, with Sylvia Chanda's term, a feminization of responsibility and or obligation. And here she is speaking to the process by which traditional gender norms, and specifically female-oriented norms of altruism, are actually being used or perpetuated by development organizations or development agendas, which kind of leave women liable for assuming much of the responsibility for meeting poverty alleviation targets, and in this context, for meeting kind of disaster risk and recovery targets. In saying that, however, women's narratives reveal a much more complex dynamic at play. So it's not a simple case of feminization of responsibility. But alongside this, the narratives really spoke of their experiences of what they termed empowerment. Okay, so they were actually telling me about what they got from their participation in the homeowners association, including self-esteem, self-worth, expanded knowledge, broadened like political networks and social networks, mobility, all of which contribute to really meaningful kind of expansion and growth, their sense of agency and independence. And many women also stood up to gender-based violence in their homes on the back of these broader personal transformations. So some really tangible positive impacts that are not always connected with disaster risk reduction management participation at the grassroots. So to conclude this presentation, I think what I hope my research shows is it reinforces that risk, vulnerability, and disasters are subjective social constructs. And this extends to risk management. This is not like risk management is in no way a neutral activity, but actually, as my research shows, participation is very much shaped by gendered norms, stereotypes, and power relations in a broader sense. And so actually what I'm arguing, and I think to try to offer some practical suggestions here, is actually that considering the everyday in evaluations of the exceptional is actually a really practical way that we can engender disaster risk reduction management and broader kind of, I think this extends to broader humanitarian approaches. In the sense that a focus on the everyday draws attention to existing power hierarchies that might otherwise go unnoticed. And it also reviews kind of hidden labors and unintended consequences, both positive and negative, associated with particular activities, in this case, community-based disaster risk management. And by focusing on the everyday, you're necessarily forced to speak to the people who are implicated in the everyday on whatever issue you're looking at. And in so doing, it really draws attention to the embodied ways in which risk and events around disaster risk are experienced by the individuals themselves. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
May I now introduce our third speaker, Aisha Ahmed, who is a lecturer in global health at St. Joseph's College and honorary lecturer at the Institute for Global Health at the UCL. Today she is going to be talking about approaches and responses to psychological sufferings from conflict. So yeah, Aisha, you have 12 minutes as well.
Okay.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invite, Poonam. So today I want to talk about the responses to psychological suffering in conflict. So my main area of work is the mental health response related to war trauma, or particularly gendered violence during conflict. And I just returned a few hours ago from Pakistan, and there I realized just how the complexities of lived experiences of conflict are. There's, I was speaking with people. I was on leave, but it seemed to be everything gears towards work, when on leave. And speaking with local people I met from Kashmir, who live in lived experiences of their war, Afghans who have come into Pakistan for the conflicts there, speaking with local friends about what it's like to live under intense security, even just going to work and having to go through security procedures, the reminders of the constant threats that are there in the presence of everyday life. And that's what I'm trying to draw on in my work, to think about how can we conceptualize the frameworks to understand the lived experiences of war and conflict and relate that to trauma, and particularly then our response to trauma and those gendered notions of trauma as well. So the reason I'm working in this area is because of the lack of representation of lived experiences of war, and how war trauma becomes conceptualized within this biomedical framework of understanding trauma, a medicalized notion of trauma. And it has important bearings on then the way that we respond to and understand people's experiences of war. In the UK, I provide expert reports for asylum seekers, focusing on mental health and some of the social, cultural aspects of their context and diagnoses of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, etc. When I see the interpretation or the response from the Home Office around testimonies of trauma, war trauma, there are so many, how can I say, gaps in understanding because of conceptions about if you've gone through torture, for example, then you must be able to record every single detail of that torture because it's such a significant life life event, but that is not the case for people who experience torture and the impact of trauma on their ability to record their narrative, which they're required to do in order to prove their testimony, to prove that they're persecuted, to prove that they got eligibility to be classified as a refugee. So I want to create a greater understanding, as much as I can in my work, around suffering, around who is suffering in war and conflict, and particularly the gendered aspects of this suffering as well. And this notion of the suffered storyteller, what does it mean to tell your story of war? While I was in Pakistan, I was asked to review a documentary film actually, called The Widow of Silence, which is based on the story of a half-widow in Kashmir. So the review is coming out, I think, today. I wrote it on the plane last night. But it's a really interesting film if you get a chance to watch it, because it's a film that was designed to challenge some of the reductive narratives of a woman's experiences as a widow in war. Her whole destiny was being defined by the fact that her husband had gone missing in a conflict, leading to her identity as a half-widow. And she had to wait for 7 years to pass before she was able to get the death certificate for her husband to be able to continue with her life. And the story revolves around that. So to think about the silencing that takes place through our lack of a holistic understanding of trauma. So we know, actually last week the WHO published their latest article, and it's also in the Lancet, about again calling for an urgent need. There was a call in 2015, and again the call, I think, was published on June the 11th. It was more of my holiday reading around the urgent need for humanitarian response to mental health in emergencies. But we need to be very careful and cautious about the way that we universalize and translate our biomedical frameworks to understanding these notions of trauma, particularly because the biomedical framework is a neutral framework. It doesn't have the space for gendered experiences of trauma. I think, this is the quote I wanted to refer to by Dr. Summerfield, who's been very critical around the way that trauma has been included within the global mental health framework. And he says the current concept of trauma in line with the traditional Western biomedicine psychology to regard the singular human being as the basic unit of study and to prescribe technical solution. So the outcome of applying post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, might be one avenue for providing a person with supporting resources that they would not otherwise be able to access. But at the same time, there is a danger of annihilating the consequences of war, that the pathology is existing within the individual without recognizing the consequences of war, that actually what they've been subjected to are human rights violations. So thinking about those medicalized aspects of PTSD and trying to counteract it with the stories of war. How can we bring out the narratives of war into the work that we do, and to understand the complexities, that it's not that it surpasses the calculation of deciding which traumatic event created the PTSD when you're assessing a patient as a psychiatrist or as a health professional in a humanitarian context, or when you're analyzing whether asylum seeker's testimony has been traumatized enough in order to be still facing risk of persecution. So how can we bring in these lived experiences? So these are just some examples of ways that silencing has been overcome. So the structural violence that's inherent in the silencing, particularly from a gender perspective as well, we see that in both men and women, in the way that the spaces and structures in which they can express the ways that they are experiencing the conflict, especially when these conflicts are chronic, as in the cases I've mentioned, and the ways that when we're thinking about post-traumatic stress disorder or complex PTSD even, then we're reliant on that trauma being terminated, but actually in the conflicts that we're seeing, this trauma is chronic. Even after that person has left the site of trauma, that trauma does not end. Many of my friends, the first thing they do when they wake up in the morning is check their phone to see if they've had time differences, to check if any messages have come through. I might be on the way to work and somebody will call me and say, oh, there was a suicide attack today. So the constant living, even from a distance of war, what that impact. But also the ways that the restrictions on voicing your experiences of war are trying to be tackled. So, for example, even during the Taliban regime, we still see to this day examples in Afghanistan of the resistance against silencing. So, women who will risk their lives to organize undercover writing classes, literacy classes, poetry classes. Poetry was banned during the Taliban regime, to be able to still express their stories, whereas often we see somebody, there's a danger of reducing trauma to the passive, silent victim is not able to express. So the work that myself and my colleagues have been doing is developing a trauma therapeutic intervention using traditional storytelling to be more contextualized within these contexts where we're working in, particularly Afghanistan, Kashmir, and now in Pakistan, about the ways that stories are told or framed in these cultural landscapes, which tend to be in a different structure to the linear past, present, future structure that the biomedical framework of analysing trauma depends on. And these are just some excerpts from there's actually, I'll take a step back, there's an article come out today, I think it's in the Diplomat, around how Afghan Puchis, so Puchi is the word for nomadic tribe, how Afghan Puchi women are invisible, and because of the articles about their vulnerability to gender-based violence, sexual violence, child marriage, and how the health policies and the government responses and international health organizations have not even developed any programs of assistance to this population. And it was a really interesting article about the way that it was framing vulnerability and how that was leading to their invisibility and marginalization without actually critiquing the structures that created that silencing. Instead, it rendered those women almost voiceless, whereas actually these women have been self-sustaining for centuries, and that aspect was not brought in. And there was, okay, thank you. There was also the phrase around how there's no research that's been done in this population, so all the work is anecdotal. So this is why I included these, because often I get really frustrated in the reports that I'm writing that the evidence or literature that I wish was there is not there, because the lived experiences of people who've experienced war, especially from a gender perspective, is not represented in the literature. It's quantified more in terms of statistics. So these are some examples. Actually, I'll just, in some time, I'll just mention the first one, which was by a scientist I worked with last year, who's a medical doctor in his country. And when he received a letter to go to a psychiatrist for assessment, he said, Aisha, why am I going to a psychiatrist? I need safety, I need asylum in your country. And I explained about you've undergone torture, you've undergone trauma, it's an assessment then that will be provided as part of the asylum application. And his response was, well, does my story make me sick? He was so perplexed about the idea that his story had to be medically assessed when he wanted to be able to live in safety. So I've been trying to, in my work, I've been trying to move to more of a framework around landscape and how that landscape is experienced, particularly from a gender perspective. Referring to your homeland as your motherland, for example, personifying your land, Kabul Jan, a term of endearment usually given to somebody older than you. What does it mean when your land and yourself, your own identity become inherently linked? In some other places I was in Pakistan, in Peshawar, for example, a few days ago, I saw maybe 5 women the whole day I was there. So the ways that conflict then experience impact on your mobility and your lived experiences. And this is just an example of an Afghan work, which now, if you can't see it, but the works are designed to tell a story. There's a wonderful book called The World is a Carpet, which depicts the 4 women's lives in northern Afghanistan and how the conflict has impacted on their weaving of the carpets that their mothers have taught them and their grandmothers taught them. And in this work, you will see that there's army tanks and drones incorporated in the carpet. So how war changes your narrative. So I'm going to conclude quickly, just to say that at the moment, the space for war trauma narratives is confined to the clinical encounter, but this becomes captured by this reductionistic tendency to temporalize trauma to particular events. That trauma happened then, now it's the present, and the future is being foreshortened because of the symptoms of the PTSD, without understanding the heavy impact of the lived experiences of war, and the role of telling the story of war trauma in order to bring to light the actual consequences of war on human rights. Thank you.
So our final presenter is Heidi Riley. She is assistant professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at University College London. And today she is going to be talking about masculinity and change in the People's Liberation Army of Nepal. 12 minutes, Heidi.
University College Dublin. University College Dublin.
Oh, yeah, University College Dublin. I said London.
So that's no problem at all. Thank you very much, Fiona, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much, Fiona, for inviting me. As Fiona says, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research on male collective identity in Nepal and masculinities during the conflict in Nepal. I'm going to particularly focus on a recent article, recently published in the Feminist Journal of International Politics, but it's part of a kind of more broader project which looked which kind of examined changing notions of masculinity within insurgent groups during conflict and in the transition to post-conflict. So in the research project, I looked specifically at the case of Nepal and looked at how changes in masculinity within members of the People's Liberation Army, looking at 4 different time frames. So starting with pre-conflict, and then during conflict, during the DDR process, and then moving into post-conflict. And I was particularly looking at insurgent groups that espouse a kind of greater level of gender equality than what exists in society. And I'll expand on that a little bit more, but this is why I particularly focused on the case of Nepal. So just to note, in this presentation, although I looked at the 4 different time frames, I'm going to specifically focus on the conflict period, which is what the time frame that the paper is focused upon. So, the title of the paper is Male Collective Identity in the People's War in Nepal, and it asks, as a primary research question, I'm just going to jump this first slide, how does the gender equal ideology espoused by an insurgent group impact upon male cadres' gender identity and their perceptions of women? And I address this question specifically in the context of Nepal. And I think it's an important question to ask. Firstly, from a kind of more broader context, when we look at gender or we examine gender or changes in gender dynamics, we tend to focus on the study of women. But of course, gender is a relational concept, so that relies on the relationship between masculinity and femininity. So it's important also, I would argue, to look at masculinity. Also, I think it's important question to ask in terms of understanding the gendered organisation within an insurgent group. Also, to uncover how group ideology impacts upon members' identity. and how that changes during post-conflict, but also from a conflict transition perspective, to build a greater understanding of the social experiences that insurgent members are subject to in order to better approach effective reintegration, or to reveal possibilities or possible opportunities for including former insurgent members in post-conflict transition. So I'm just going to make a couple of clarifications at this point. So the collective that I'm looking at are low-level male members of the People's Liberation Army in Nepal. And when I'm looking at changes in gender identity and perceptions, it's a kind of a bit of an abstract concept. So what I'm specifically looking at is changes in attitudes towards gender-specific roles and conduct, towards changes in notions of acceptable behaviour within male-female interactions, and also changes in perceptions of gender hierarchies. I just briefly, I should outline why Nepal is a good case for this study. In the interest of time, I won't go into too many details around the case study itself, but for those of you that don't know the Nepalese context as well, the civil war in Nepal lasted between 1996 and 2006, led by the Communist Party, Nepal Maoists, largely a rural insurgency, which gained traction in many parts of Nepal, and in fact by the end of the conflict, the Maoists were controlled roughly 80% of the land, although it did not undo the capital. So anyway, just to clarify why Nepal's a good case in the context of this research, primarily the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists, who led the insurgency, advocated in their ideology and their rhetoric for change from the traditional pre-conflict gender norms in which women were subject to high levels of social, political, and economic exclusions, as well as being subject to gender discriminatory, harmful practices. And so the Marxist-informed ideology called for empowerment of women within what was envisaged as the new Nepal they were fighting for. Now, I have to clarify at this point, I'm not saying by any means that the Maoists were advocating for some sort of, perfect gender equality. What I'm advocating, I'm stating at this point is that they argued for a more gender equal ideology than what had existed within pre-conflict Nepal. Secondly, within the PLA, there was very high levels of female participation, so roughly 40% by the end of the conflict. And thirdly, whereas pre-conflict Nepal was particularly patriarchal and hierarchical, it meant that while men tended to be associated with the public arena, women were traditionally expected to be more domestic. So for many men, participation in the PLA was the first time that they'd experienced working alongside women. So just referring back to the question again, really what it relates to is how men in the PLA, who were at the forefront alongside women of enforcing and promoting marriage policies, which also related to change in gender relations, how they experienced a different gendered social organisation than what they had experienced prior to joining the insurgency. So a very brief note on the methodology. So it was a qualitative study that relied on semi-structured narrative interviews with former members of the PLA, predominantly men, because I was focusing on masculinity, but also I conducted a number of interviews with women. It's obviously important to understand gender relations from the perspective of women. There was interviews were carried out across various 11 districts of Nepal, and I included ethnic diversity in the sample. Diverse, so it's very important to get diversity into the interview sample. On a quick note on the analytical framework, so in 2016, Abdullah Little published an article that was titled Identity as a Variable. And this paper proposed an analytical framework through which this kind of fairly abstract concept of collective identity could be usefully observed So one of the dimensions through which they argue that this can be that collective identity can be observed is through what they term relational comparisons. And this can be understood as the way that one identity group views another identity group. So in other words, by looking closely at the way that one identity group or collective, so we say the in-group, views or perceives or portrays another identity group, or the out-group, tells us something or is revealing in the way that members of the in-group perceive their own identity as a member of that group. So in order to operationalize this in my paper, I selected 3 different out-groups through which I could analyze the kind of in-group out-group perspective. So firstly, the state forces, secondly, female PLA members, and thirdly, the rural population. So, findings. I'm going to just highlight here, in the interest of time, 3 of my main findings. So, of course, I'm happy to elaborate on it further in the Q&A at the end. So, firstly, my first finding was that whether it was real or imagined, male respondents inferred that the promotion of greater gender equality was an important dimension of their sense of identity as the kind of progressive Maoist man. This is going there. And they often describe themselves as the kind of protectors of women's rights in the villages, and they like to portray an image of kind of greater gender equality and respect for women in the ranks, both within the practices of the institution of the PLA and within more quotidian life. So this was particularly evident when discussing their own attitudes towards the gender equality in comparison to the state forces. So the police and the army, for example, were described very much as kind of being moral, self-interested towards women, and exemplified by stories of alcohol abuse and barbaric violence against women. And this was placed in polar opposition to their own stories of punishing villagers for the maltreatment of women, for example. And the state forces' violent and abusive attitudes towards women were therefore placed in contrast to what was described as this kind of pro-equality gender identity that men of the PLA described. So you can see some of the quotes here that exemplify this. However, so these narratives sort of inferred this kind of perspective that pertained to some hierarchy in moral positioning in relation to men of the state forces. Now, the second finding, in relation to comparisons with the PLA women, was that there did seem to be high levels of respect for their female counterparts. But interestingly, this tended to stem from the experience of women being capable or see what they were seen as what men saw as typically masculine roles. So men would frequently express their surprise when they first experienced the physical capabilities of women, shocked that women could actually, be effective on the battlefield, or that they could be effective in use of a weapon. So, for example, this first quote, we used to think that women can be leaders, but I've never thought that a woman was capable of firing guns and fighting war like a man. So it was kind of idealizing this kind of masculine behaviors. So it kind of, what can be drawn from this is that what was portrayed in the narratives was that women were afforded respect through proving themselves in masculine roles. The third finding that I'm going to mention here is that it stems from the relation and comparison with the rural population. So it reveals a subtle difference in the ideology of equality in relation to which women were worthy of emancipation. So I found that where rural women were unmarried and had the potential to fight as part of the movement, they were perceived as targets for emancipation via the revolution. But those that were already married were instead perceived predominantly in domestic terms to serve the revolution through the provision of food, but often under the direction of their husband. So this quote here comes from a woman who, as you can see, her best friend was recruited, but she wasn't because she was married. She was often made to gather food in the middle of the night in order for the PLA to stay in the house. But this was done under the instruction of her husband and of her brother-in-law. What does this show? Well, in conclusion, overall, I found that evidence that the kind of gender equality ideology and the high levels of female participation in the PLA did impact on the gendered identity of male recruits towards a masculine identity that supported the promotion of gender equality, but often manifest in a masculine identity that was understood as being the kind of protector and the promoter of gender equality. It's the type of masculinity that's often talked in the literature, talks about in the literature as this kind of new man masculinity. And so the gender regime and social arrangements in the PLA facilitated by this ideology did to some extent normalize working alongside women regardless of a distasteful position that women had to kind of prove themselves as kind of demonstrating masculine qualities in order to earn that kind of respect. But of course, changes in the way that women were perceived by their male counterparts and the changes in the masculine identity that was experienced during the war can't be claimed to be informed, to be uniform, and that there is nuance obviously across the finding. Just the one last point here, which I won't go into, but I can go into the Q&A, is around the curtailing of gender-based violence. But just to sort of sum this up, what does this study show? It's only one case, but it also it challenges the characterization of former rebel combatants in DDR processes as a source of insecurity rather than anything else. And aside from the engagement with violence, the experience of insurgency also includes a social dimension, which often diverges from the social life and context, and is also context specific. And the study therefore highlights that there's a need to maybe diverge from the norm of reintegration programs that tend to take a starting point from the post-conflict moment rather than taking into account the social, political, and historical context from where ex-combatants have arrived. Now, I've run out of time, so I was going to say a couple more points, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for wonderful presentations. I'm not going to dare to even summarize any of the presentations, but what I have done is I have taken some notes and I have identified some of the themes that were coming across all of the presentations. So one of the things that came up was the lived experiences. And we talked about complexity of the lived experiences. Not just looking at it in binary form like victims and agents, but the complexity of the experiences of people in disaster context as well as in conflict and humanitarian context, about sometimes them being victim as well as sometimes them exercising their agency as well. Another theme that was coming out in your presentation was the notion of identity or identities that came up quite a lot. And also you talked about gendered experiences. And by gender, we were not only talking about women, but what we were doing was the social construction of gender roles and relationships. And we were talking about masculinities and femininities, feminization and participation, as well as different forms of expression of masculinities. We also talked about silence and invisibility. So sometimes some issues are hypervisible, some issues are invisible. And we talked quite a lot about silences and invisibility. We also talked about psychological and social consequences. We talked about time and boundaries. when is it going to start and when is it going to end, and when should the intervention start and when should it end. And we also talked about the consequences of medicalization of humanitarian interventions as well. And another thing we talked about was global versus local, understanding of various rights within the local context as well as the international global level. So I would like to inform you that this panel is being recorded and live streamed, so people who could not attend are also able to actually follow this panel, and it is also for you to go back, and if you would like to refer to one of the presentations or the presentations, then you have it there. Now I would like to open the floor for question and answer. Please introduce yourself and briefly say who you are and direct your question to the panelists. And I'll take 3 to 4 questions at a time, and then we'll go for the next round. So may I now open the floor for questions and comments? Please keep it brief, just for the time's sake.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you. My question is for Aidan. Thank you very much. Could you tell us what the size of the queer population is within different refugee populations? And you mentioned fluidity, but in terms of partying, is there fluidity as a result of the stress of becoming part of the refugee population?
Any more? Yeah. You go first and then you go.
Yeah, my question is to Aidan as well, and the question is related to people who are seeking asylum based on fluidity. So you talked about teleological subjectivities and identity rights. Obviously, I do agree people coming from especially Middle East Asia or South Asia won't be identifying themselves as queer folks clearly, but at the same time will be engaging in expressions and behaviors which are queer-like. So how do they deal with the dilemma? I mean, like, obviously, they do not assume an identity, but at the same time, they do reflect on those behaviors and expressions and mannerisms and demeanors which clearly classify them as queer. So how do they deal with the dilemma and moral dilemma, especially at the intersubjective level? And before even disclosing that or talking to anybody while seeking any kind of sanctions or any kind of approvals or any kind of considerations as a person who is seeking asylum or refugee rights. Obviously, it varies from context to context. So, in the context of Middle East, Lebanon, and your country, Turkey, so how do they represent? That is something which I would like to know.
Thank you.
Thank you. My first question to Heidi. This men's progressive views on women, did you find out whether women agreed with these views or they have got something completely different from this view? And the second question is to Aisha. Your expert report for the Home Office on behalf of asylum seeker. Did you find those reports were useful for asylum seeker or the Home Office? Just don't consider them.
I can take one more question.
Hello, John Mitchell from Nancy University, Journalism to Disaster Research New Zealand. Question to Heidi. Although your study seems to be focusing on the conflict period itself, the ideology seems to be very powerful and pervasive across the society. What impact has it had on views in relation to gender equality in Nepal today?
So I'm going to abuse my power and ask the question to Jordana. I have a very good question about, you talked about feminization of participation. If you could elaborate a little bit on that, that would be great, what that means. And now may I ask you to respond to some of the questions that have been asked?
Yeah. Hello, this is working. Can you hear me? So yeah, thank you so much for those very interesting questions. In response to the first question, it's very difficult to quantify the size of the queer population because of all of the various things that we've considered around, you know, visibility, potential persecution that could come from being and appearing visibly gay or queer, and as well some of the concerns that was highlighted in relation to actually the process of seeking protection. This can often be seen as a process that is that puts you at heightened risk of persecution because of the burden of proof. So some people may opt to potentially like flee a certain neighbourhood that they're living in order to live a more discreet life in certain parts of different urban areas, for example, rather than initiate like a formal process of securing international protection on those grounds. And then I think Kıvılcım's research in Turkey is very interesting because there is an attempt to quantify the number of people who are seeking international protection in Turkey based on LGBT identity. And I think the estimate there is about 700 people, which if you think about the size of the total refugee population in Turkey, about 3 million from Syria, you get a sense of actually how this is potentially kind of, it's not necessarily seen as the easy route to protection. You'd anticipate that more people would be able to apply for international protection based on the size of the population alone, but it doesn't seem to be happening. And that kind of brings me to the other point as well, and the point you raised around fluidity. I think that there's a lot of intersecting kind of identities at stake here, and a sense that actually you not only have a relationship with your own sexuality, but you may also have a relationship with your past experience of conflict, your own relationship with like immediate family members or members of your own local community. And so all of these kind of intersect to make it potentially difficult to seek protection. And as well, the association that some of these LGBT or queer-led organizations have as potentially Western-facing, but some people are as well. So there's a sense that by seeking protection, you kind of out yourself even more and put yourself at heightened risk. Because of some of those things that I was talking about earlier, the kind of clear, or at least a perceived relationship within kind of political discourse around LGBT rights and the West. And so there is a real tension there. But of course, organizations do a lot of work to try and counteract that. You know, their approach to fluidity, to try and they work in a way that is a little bit more intersectional. They don't anticipate that people will have clearly formed identity connections because of their own histories, their own cultures, their own relationship with other identity characteristics such as faith. Yet, because of the wider geopolitics of this, it's very difficult to advocate and work around LGBT rights without being sort of kind of entering into this wider sort of geopolitical issue, which I hope answers the question. And as for the second question, I think the moral dilemma, I don't know if I've answered that in relation to some of the points around. Yeah, I think, but let me know if you have other questions.
Sure. Around the feminization of participation, I think it's less about a feminization of, sorry, is that working? Thanks. Of participation, because a feminization implies a change. And I can't necessarily say that women have not been doing these roles for a long time, but I think what's important is the feminization of responsibility that is coming as these grassroots kind of mobilizations and organizations are being harnessed to serve resilience building and disaster risk reduction agendas. And I think, so in the context of that form of feminization, it's like where women's roles, as I said, are being harnessed, and specifically these notions of altruism, but also stereotypes. So men would often speak about women being better suited to these positions because they're more patient, because they're more literate, because they speak better English. So the Philippines speaks, it's multilingual in many senses, and a lot of administrative negotiations actually take place in English, and women are generally better educated than men, particularly in urban poor communities. So, although actually that's questionable to some point, but they have a higher like base level, I think, of literacy than a lot of men do in urban poor communities. So I think rather than it being a feminization of participation, I think it's important to think about the implications of how participation is being framed in the context of resilience building and how it's framed as empowering, which my research shows it is, but not in the ways that I think a lot of NGOs and the government are speaking about or thinking about empowerment.
Thank you for your question. Actually, to be honest, when I first started to work 3 years ago, I wasn't sure what to expect. Usually I'm brought in at the appeal stage, and because it's all funded by legal aid, so I think, and by that stage, usually the person has gone through several appeals before, maybe, or has gone through a long application, maybe sometimes over 10 years in limbo. And so there's a huge amount of evidence that I'm sent, and the reports generally are between 5,000 and 8,000 words long, and I get around 5 days to provide it. I've got a good relationship now with the solicitors, and I ask to be updated if the client agrees, and to see the correspondence if possible as well. To answer your question more directly, yes, the reports do seem to have a weight. So there was one report I wrote where for a family of 4, and the tribunal got cancelled on the basis of that report, and the family were granted indefinitely to remain. There's been other more frustrating times when the evidence I provided, for example, on trauma has been accepted to be professional evidence, but because I wasn't present at the time that this particular individual saw his father being shot, I could not claim that he responded in a traumatized way. So there's still a lot of, some of the responses to the work on trauma, the evidence on trauma, does again show those gaps in understanding. And usually as well, as we talk about gender, I'm referred to as a he when they respond to my reports.
Thank you very much for your question. So firstly on the question of whether women agree with some of the findings in the narratives, the short answer is yes. All of the female former PLA members that I spoke to had quite a very positive narrative of their experience of the conflict in terms of how gender relations were organised. And many in post-conflict, I would say there's sort of 2 groups in post-conflict. Those that have returned to their home villages, and those that have returned to more areas away from their families, often in areas with their highlands. Now, those that have gone back to their home villages have often been in a situation where they've had to conform to traditional traditions where, as a married woman, you move into the home of the husband. And many women that I spoke to that have returned to this particular situation, they would argue that their life during the PLA was much more empowering and actually that kind of quite, very positive memories compared to their situation currently. And those that I spoke to that were living away from their families, although they experienced in post-conflict more a greater sense of kind of similarity to their time during the conflict. They again had very positive memories of the gender relations during conflict, saying, look, I was a leader, I led a battalion, and men had to listen to me, and there was no question about this. We did the cooking and the cleaning on rotation, gender didn't come into account. Now, this is not to say that this is the experience of every woman. Certainly in the literature, it shows that, in certain areas, women experienced a greater level of equality, particularly around promotion. I mean, there was one thing that I came across was men loved to tell me about their promotion. So there was a kind of this competitive element. And I think takes place in other contexts as well. But there was very much this kind of competitive element of men. I was promoted straight away after 2 days, whereas women didn't express themselves in the same way, but they spoke of how it was easier for full promotion. So I think there was an element of that competitiveness, but overall, the women that I spoke to were very positive about their experience during conflict. In the longer term impact, and Poonam's written a lot about this as well, but I would argue that there has been some major changes in terms of gender relations, particularly at the legal level. So the new constitution, for example, although there are flaws in it, actually identifies legal rights and gender legal rights. So prior to the conflict, the constitution from the 1990s did not identify the rights of women, for example, in citizenship, in other areas of political life. The new constitution has made changes in this area. Since the signing of the peace agreement, there is now a quota of 33% women in government, which is a major change from a situation in 1990 where I think it was 3 women in areas of government. So there has been major changes. Change takes a long time, particularly in the rural areas where there are very gender discriminatory traditions. But the fact that these legal changes have taken place, that there is, for example, units, like women's units in the police, for example, there are now women in the military. This has made certain changes, and I think that even though how awful war may be, war can also be understood as some form of social process, and I think in the case of the bullet actually demonstrates. Thank you.
I can take a couple of more questions.
Hi, I'm Kieran, MSc student here, studying earthquake engineering and disaster management. The question's for Heidi. You said that perceptions of women changed for those women who were taking part in traditional male roles. However, that didn't extend to women who didn't partake in those roles. I guess maybe that's correct, but is there a way to actually help this perception to get men to do those mental acrobatics to change their perception of women who don't take these traditional male roles?
I can take 2 more. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ed. I'm from UCL. My question is for Jordana. In studying an engendered approach to DRRM, I'm just wondering whether you've noted any particular implications for the inclusion of children's rights and protection during the DRRM process.
One more last question.
Hi, I'm Beth. I'm researching disaster recovery in primary education, and kind of following that point, I was interested in kind of thinking more intersectionally about gender and kind of the generational differences. So, particularly, Joanna, with your work with the implications of having children and being a mother, and kind of some of the who's predominantly providing the care for children, and also the extra risks of children, kind of some of the psychological disorders that they can suffer after the time of crisis. So.
Thank you. I'm going to start from here. You can start.
Okay.
And on the last question, anyone can
Sure. Okay, so briefly, so yes, certainly my findings showed that there was a difference in rural women feel like women were respected in terms of what was expected for them in terms of their roles. And I would argue that one of the reasons for this is around the institution, the importance of the institution of marriage. That this is a long tradition of the woman being so the dominant figure of the man within the institution of marriage, but also around childcare. And one of the things that I found was that although men spoke about greater respect for taking on women's roles, women taking on men's roles, they didn't really talk about men taking on women's roles beyond the kind of cooking and cleaning and whatever within the institution of the PLA. But childcare, for example, was something that was never really spoken of being a kind of a man's role. So we still have the conversation around women being biologically the giver of life, so therefore childcare falls onto the role of childcare. So, for example, women were kind of celebrated for having a baby during the conflict, leaving it with a family member and coming back to fight. But there was no kind of conversation around men taking on some of those roles of childcare roles. And I think that kind of post-conflict, this kind of idea of the men being the breadwinner, women being child carers, although there has been kind of shifts in women, less opposition to women working, education of women, for example, but women are expected to do that as well as taking on childcare. So I think that's where the challenge comes in, is how you kind of this kind of the association of women and children and men, that those kind of structural norms need to be addressed.
Okay, thanks for the question. So starting with the first one around child rights. So my research didn't go into that space much, being totally honest, but through my work with the provincial disaster risk reduction teams and the municipal ones as well, there's some really, really exciting work taking place in the Philippines that looks like child-centered participatory mapping to like track areas of risk and vulnerability and to see both disaster but like everyday encounters with risk through the lens of young people and children in particular. There's also some really exciting work taking place in schools, and I think actually Cebu, as like the province, the city region, is leading on that in the Philippines in several ways, where they're working with schools to teach them about like to integrate disaster risk as like a fundamental part of the curriculum, but also looking at the ways in which young people, including like children, so not just adolescents, are as kind of critical vectors of information transfer and knowledge exchange within their communities. So yeah, there's quite a lot going on there, and we can speak more on the break actually if you want me to put you in contact with some people. In terms of a more intersectional approach, and that's a really great question and super relevant to the Philippines, not so much, not only I guess in terms of mothering, which my research shows like through that kind of childcare focus and just the reproductive responsibilities, generally speaking, having an implication on the kinds of activities that women are getting involved in within their communities. But actually thinking about how migration, and so the Philippines being like a big exporter of people worldwide, so and predominantly women actually, leaving families behind and having a high number of grandparent-headed and male-headed kind of families, single-parent male-headed families, where there might be aunts or other like sisters that are coming in to help support childcare, but actually thinking about this in the context of information exchange through these informal networks of homeowner associations, which are not necessarily always tapped into, I think, internationally. When we think about, disaster risk reduction, we think about it in quite a hazard focus, kind of connects with the biomedical, technical language that we use to think about risk and hazard and these events. And actually, if you think about the more informal ways that risk is managed, that conversations take place around risk and how communities come together, what I highlighted as something for us to think about again in engendering disaster risk reduction is if these spaces are feminized, not exclusively, but largely, what then happens to single male-headed families where men might be away, where they might not be involved in these very critical kind of spaces of knowledge exchange and yeah, just like advocacy. So, and the same goes for grandparent-headed families where they might not be able to engage in these spaces of community exchange. So I think, again, thinking beyond the binary is really helpful here and contextualizing that in specific locations that we're working is really important.
So it's about time, 11 o'clock. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and thank you so much for your